Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. Well, the drama in Ottawa was supposed to be about whether or not the Carney budget was going to pass and the government would fall. And that's still out there, by the way, as we do this podcast. The House is dark this week because of Remembrance Day, but they're going to be back to work in a couple of days. There'll be another budget vote. But drama now is shifting totally onto the Conservative Party and Pierre Poilievre. We mentioned this on a previous podcast, but it's getting pretty ugly right now. We've talked about some of the polling that has gone on, and what I find is a strong indicator as to just how serious the problems are with Poilievre and his leadership, or lack thereof, of the Conservative Party, is when the pundits and the political observers start to weigh in on this, and they're doing that now in large numbers. I'm going to reference a couple of pieces on the show today. The first one is from John Iveson from the National Post. John's a guy that I used to have on the radio show many times. I got a lot of respect for John. We don't always agree on his opinion versus mine, but he's fair-minded and a great writer too. The piece that is published in the Post today is called "Bad Blood Has Infected Poilievre's Conservatives, and the Liberals Are Loving It." And there's a couple of quotes here that I wanted to get into that John included in the column here. And one of them, of course, he begins the piece talking about and referring to the interview that Poilievre did that was with Northern Perspective podcast last month. Now, we've mentioned this on the podcast, too, that, there's some rather controversial things that he said during that. And I'll start right down here because Iveson quotes Poilievre saying, "We have had very little dissent over the past year." He says, "When was the last time you saw an internal fight? This isn't the Jerry Springer show. We're not throwing chairs at each other." And Iveson goes on to write, he says, "Well, that was obviously long before Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer and Chief Whip Chris Warkentin are said to have barged into the office of then current, now former Conservative MP Chris d'Entremont and called him a snake for negotiating a seat on the Liberal benches." This was d'Entremont's allegation, of course. That was his perspective on this, and that was his take on it. The opposition leader's office said the two men calmly entered the office, and Scheer spoke in a calm and measured voice. Okay, be that as it might. But therein lies the controversy. So it's timing, I guess. In politics, right? Timing is almost everything. Simply because, Poilievre is trying to create an image here that say, well, we're a unified party. Everybody's on the same page. We're all singing off the same song sheet. Well, it wasn't 24 hours later after that was published that we saw some of the things that started to fall apart here. And Iveson touches on that in his column. He goes on to write, he says, "Poilievre's comments about inter-caucus harmony long preceded the OL statement that d'Entremont is a liar who willfully deceived his colleagues and voters because he didn't get the role of Deputy Speaker of the House. They were also made long before Edmonton MP Matt Generot met Prime Minister Mark Carney, presumably with a view to crossing the floor, before arriving at the conclusion that he would instead resign his seat." Now, speculation is that he was threatened with past indiscretion, was denied by Generot. He says that never really happened. He was not coerced. But as Iveson writes, but even if he was, of course he's going to deny that. He was going to say that was the situation. But what it does here is, I think, and Iveson, I think, shines the light on, there is discontent within the Liberal caucus. And this is not just a rumor, and it's not just a fabrication of the Liberals that are saying, aha, you see they're infighting there. They're doing it right out front. And Iveson goes on to say that there's actually a history for this, too, that needs to be, I think, addressed, and it's a problem. He goes on, I love, that's one of the things I love about John's writing. He references House of Cards as I think, a foundation for some of the discontent here. And he means the British House of Cards, by the way, first of all, which was a much better show than the one that Kevin Spacey did. The fictional prime minister, of course, in the original House of Cards was Prime Minister Francis Urquhart, and he was a scoundrel, devoid of ethics. If you've seen the show, it's fabulous. But this is a quote from the TV show, but I think it's very applicable, and so does Iveson, as he puts it in a column. He's quoting the fictional character, Prime Minister Francis Urquhart, who says, "It is not respect, but fear that motivates a man," the fictional character Urquhart famously said. "When a man is afraid, you will crush him, utterly destroy him. His respect will always follow. Base fear is intoxicating, overwhelming, and liberating." It's pretty strong stuff, isn't it? But as I'm reading that, and as you're reading Iverson's column, does the image of Pierre Poilievre not come to mind when you start hearing words like that? Well, apparently it does, and not just within the public, but also within the Conservative caucus. Iverson goes on to say, he says, when I spoke with MPs I spoke with, they were unimpressed by the leadership tactics. Pierre and Scheer's past actions are coming home to roost, according to one MP who spoke off the record, purportedly in order to avoid being the next on the hit list. He says they've been acting like bitter juveniles. So now, of course, the Conservatives, as they want to do, are going to turn it around and say, no, everything's fine within our caucus. It's the Liberals that are creating this controversy. No, it's not. It's right there in front of our eyes. I mean, this is it. Listen to what you're hearing, watch what you're seeing, and forget about what Andrew Scheer is saying. He's trying to put his own particular spin on this. And we know that they're under damage control. We haven't seen a lot of Pierre Poilievre in the last couple of days, have we? We're told now it's because behind the scenes, he's been busy calling MPs and others in the caucus trying to drum up support. Because don't forget, there is a leadership review coming up in January. And let's face it, those numbers are going to be very, very important. Is this going to be leading to more defections, or are other Conservative MPs grumbling behind the scenes? Well, we may never know, because they certainly tighten the ship right now, and we're not so much sure about how much more information is going to come out there. But it does raise the question about what Iverson just wrote about. Are they governing through fear as opposed to respect? And he quotes Brian Mulroney. Now, Mulroney, love him or like him, first of all, had, the largest majority ever in any government, not just a Conservative government, served 2 terms, and things kind of went south very quickly, of course, in that second term, and he left office, and King Campbell took over. But Mulroney said, power and respect cannot be demanded. Goodwill must be earned. And Mulroney was a master of that, and which is one of the reasons why I think a lot of Conservatives that I've talked to, and we've talked about this on the podcast, are very concerned about the direction that their party has taken in. And now I contend, and have contended, of course, on the podcast, that the Stephen Harper era was really the death of the Conservative Party. I know they did this amalgamation with the Reform Party and with the Progressive Conservative Party and became the Conservative Party. But the reality is, it's the Reform Party. All right, it's their ideals, it's their mindset, it's their style of governing too that has taken over right now. And longtime conservatives, former progressive conservatives, like people like Mulroney and others, are feeling disenfranchised right now. And I think a lot of them are leaning towards Mark Carney as a result of this. Iverson goes on to write about people that worked on the election campaign, talking about Poilievre, and said that he acted as his own campaign manager, but was unwilling to assume any accountability. One of the people that's quoted here, and I think it's a very insightful quote, was from Reagan Watts. Now, Reagan Watts was a former advisor to another great conservative bon vivant, the late Jim Flaherty, who I interviewed many times. And up on the screen right now, look at what Reagan Watts says about Poilievre. This is, he continues to be a fork in a world full of soup. Think about that great analogy. Yeah, he's got to figure out how to be a spoon, according to Reagan Watts. And therein lies the problem. This guy can't pivot. And what Iverson's talking about are things that we've mentioned here on the podcast time and time again, is that this is a guy who, first of all, is not a people person. And if you're in politics and you're not a people person, you got a big, big disadvantage right off the bat. But he doesn't treat people with respect. He doesn't certainly treat the media with respect. He doesn't treat his opposition colleagues with respect. And apparently he doesn't even treat his own people in his own caucus with any respect. And that does come back to bite you. And it happens. It happened, as Iverson wrote about in his piece today, it happened in the fictional House of Cards miniseries, and it's happening in real life. If the people that are under you don't like you and don't respect you, your life as a leader is pretty short. And we're wondering if the same thing is about to happen to Poilievre. So it's useful to look at exactly what's going to be happening in here. He also talks about the fact, of course, that the leadership review is coming up. But I'm wondering now about the mood of the people and what's going to be happening. As he says, right now the Liberals are loving this. I mean, if you're a Liberal strategist right now, and you see these polls coming out that people are just not liking Poilievre, and it seems to be a number that's increasing. You want, hey, keep this guy on as leader, because as long as he's leader, the Liberals feel they're pretty solid and things are going to be going their way. Now, we'll see what's going to happen in the long term. But to underscore that, I want to reference another piece that I read just the other day. And it's from Bruce Anderson. Bruce, of course, is with Spark Insights right now. He's been a pollster in this country for many, many years. And by the way, and a self-confessed former progressive conservative. He always had that perspective. And Bruce, even though he's no longer a member of the Conservative Party, is still, I would think, looking at some of his writings, a small C conservative. And so he's looking at it through that lens. His Substack this week was fascinating. It was published actually on November the 11th, on Remembrance Day. And the headline is rather daunting, I guess, if you're a Poilievre fan. I think there's still a few of them out there somewhere, aren't there? Anyway, it says 47% of those on the right believe it's best to choose a new leader for the Conservative Party. Yeah, that's not the sort of thing that Poilievre wants to hear. This is the piece that was on Bruce's Substack about the survey that was done. And it's looking at this right now. It says, we know exactly what's going to be happening here. The question the Conservatives have to ask is whether 2024 was the peak for Poilievre. He says, to answer that, it's useful to look at why 2024 was such a good year for him. Poilievre didn't become more popular. If anything, he alienated more people. He just did it at a slower pace than his main rival, Justin Trudeau. And he goes on to write, Trudeau's scar tissue is normal for somebody who's been the head of government after 10 years. You make your choices, you disappoint some. The latest polling indicates right now that Poilievre has charmed 41% of the people, but he's turned off 45% of the people. He's created a lot of negative opinion about himself without having to take the kind of major decision political leader takes. Now, that's an important point that he includes here. All right. For all the people that just don't like Poilievre and can't stand him and don't like what he's been doing, he's never been in power. Imagine if this was the guy that was actually wielding the power. This was the guy that was representing Canada at the G7, the G20, at NATO meetings, deciding on policies, deciding on infrastructure. If he can't get it right when he's on the other side, the opposition side, what kind of a leader do you think he's going to be? And Anderson talks about that. He says you could argue that the spotlight shines on himself, that he ignored the evidence that his personality was rubbing people the wrong way. Maybe he knew about that and just said, who gives a damn? Or maybe he didn't know about it. I find it difficult to believe. But this is the situation that he finds himself in right now. And Bruce Anderson includes this graph here in his Substack. Feelings about Mark Carney, very positive, 20%, positive, 37%. Negative and very negative year 17 and 17. But look at Poilievre, very positive, only 13%, positive, only 28%, very negative, 28%. I mean, how do you overcome something like that? And that's the question that conservatives, in their heart of hearts, have to ask themselves these days. It's not going well. And the Canadian public, and now we're starting to find more and more evidence that not just the Canadian public, but even conservatives, whether they're in the caucus or just conservative supporters, are starting to have those very same doubts about Poilievre and his leadership. And Anderson talks about this, and I think the numbers bear this out in the Substack. Now, when asked in our last survey what would be best for the Conservative Party, 64% said the party would be better off to change leaders. Now, that includes 33% of those who are currently planning on voting Conservative, and 47% of those who consider their politics to be right of center. Now, on the center, about half of all voters are right there. So 2 out of 3 people think the Conservatives are going to be better off with somebody new. That's very telling. And there's an interesting point that he includes in this that I touched on briefly a couple of podcasts ago, but I want to reiterate it again since Bruce brought it up. And it's here in the piece on your screen. Stephen Harper didn't see Poilievre as cabinet material after he won the election in 2006, or after the election in 2008, or after the election in 2011. That's 3 separate times Stephen Harper was elected prime minister, elected as cabinet, selected as cabinet. Poilievre was not included any of those times. And it was only in the finally, by the way, in 2013, he gave Poilievre a Minister of State role. Now, that with no portfolio, by the way. It just kind of means, okay, you've been around long enough. You can have a seat at the big table right now with no major responsibilities. It was only after the final months of Harper's 10 years in office that he finally gave Poilievre a full cabinet post. And by that time, and here's an interesting number, by that time, Harper had cycled through more than 70 other Conservative MPs before he finally got around to giving Poilievre a cabinet post. 70 other people in that Conservative caucus were given jobs in the cabinet before he said, Poilievre. You know what this reminds me of? A very Canadian metaphor here. Poilievre was the last guy picked for the road hockey game. You were all throw sticks in. No, I don't want. I want this guy. I'll take this. Finally, I said, "Okay, Pierre, I guess you can be on my team, I suppose." He's not anybody's first choice, second choice, or third choice, including Stephen Harper's. Now, I know you're going to say, "Well, Harper supported him in the last election." Well, that's his job. as the former leader and as a former prime minister. Of course, he's going to come out there and say that Poilievre was a leader. But actions speak louder than words. What have I always said on this podcast? Don't just listen to what they say. Watch what they do. Harper didn't think this guy was up to snuff. He didn't think Poilievre was leadership material until the very last days of his campaign. And that tells you an awful lot as to what's going on here. So, therein lies the problem. Now, how do you juxtapose this with what's going to happen in Poilievre's political future and by extension, Canada's political future? Well, as I said, I'm sure they're going to the government, the Carney government's going to survive this vote next week, and the government will continue. But Poilievre's got other issues now, including the leadership review. And I know that you can look at this kind of with mixed feelings. It's part of the constitution of the Conservative Party, by the way, after the election to do this, especially since they didn't win. And there are those that are going to say, come on, he's going to win this thing. And that may actually happen, but by how much? Because just as we're talking now about the vote on the budget in the House of Commons right now is a de facto vote about confidence in the government. Well, the leadership review that Poilievre is going to undergo in January is the same thing. It's a vote about their confidence in Pierre Poilievre. And Bruce talks about that. Bruce Anderson talks about that in the Substack. That talks about exactly what's going to be happening here. How much support? You know he's going to win because there's nobody running against him. That's not the question. It's do the Conservative people in their heart of hearts believe that he's the guy that can lead them in the next election and possibly win the next election. Now, are those that are going to say, well, come on, they increased their seat total. You got to give him credit for that. Yeah, but he lost his own seat. And do you give the leader credit for that? Or is it, again, with the Conservative increases in the last federal election, really just due to the hangover about the anger and the distaste many people had for Justin Trudeau? It's an argument that can be made here. And I think Conservatives have to take off the rose-colored glasses and look at this practically here. When they do this leadership review, what's good enough? Well, Bonnie Crombie went through a leadership review. Bonnie was now the former leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, hadn't been on the job for very long, got crushed in the last provincial election, of course, and their Liberals, of course, are still squandering in the political vast lands now, trying to find their direction here in Ontario anyway. But she got less than the desired amount in the leadership review, so she stepped aside. And it has happened with other political leaders, too. So what's that number? What number does Poilievre have to shoot for here? Because he's not competing against anybody. He's competing against himself in the leadership review. And Anderson talks about that. 9 weeks until the Conservatives decide if they want Poilievre to be their leader. As Bruce says, I have no doubt that he's going to win a majority of those votes, given his attention to organization. But anything less than 80% would leave him weakened and his party destabilized. If that first number is a 7, well, hell may continue to break loose in Conservative ranks. One thing is clear, though, as Bruce writes, he says betting on Poilievre is betting that somebody who's been in politics for 20 years is going to grow more popular. And the odds tell us that rarely happens. And I think that's the message that Conservatives have to take here. This guy's on the downward sled. If he peaked in 2024, was it because people really gravitated to Poilievre? Their anger and their hatred for Trudeau was so strong. Well, the latter might actually be more along the lines of what actually happened here, because if you look at what happened as soon as Mark Carney became the leader, Poilievre crashed in the polls, and of course the Liberals won that election, albeit by a minority government. So is this the guy? And that's the question they have to ask. Scott Moe, Premier of Saskatchewan, they just went through a leadership review, you may recall, about a week and a half or so ago. Moe got 80%, 81%, I think it was, of support. Well, that's a pretty strong mandate to say, yeah, we got your back. You're the guy we need. You're the guy we want. If Poilievre gets anything less than that, and there's a possibility that may happen, he's got to consider stepping aside for the sake of the party, or if in fact he even has the party's best interest in mind. Because I know I've talked to some people who are Conservative supporters who have said that their main concern about Poilievre, aside from his acerbic personality, is that he puts himself first ahead of the party. And they saw that in the last federal election. The Conservative campaign, the television campaign, which was extensive, by the way, and very costly, was all about Poilievre, Pierre, him raising, he and his wife raising a flag in the middle of an empty field someplace. Poilievre, as opposed to policy. There's an egocentricity to what Poilievre is doing right now, and I think it turns off an awful lot of people. So two very poignant pieces that I think the conservatives and those that are going to be supportive of Poilievre and those who may be on the fence about Poilievre as a leader are really going to have to think about, I think, very strongly over the next little while. And as John Iverson pointed out in the National Post, the Liberals are loving this. I mean, when you see, your rival self-destructing, common sense says step back and let it happen. Don't get involved in the fray. Just let them, self-destruct. Watch what happens here. And that seems to be happening, despite Poilievre's comments that in that previous podcast that everything is one big happy family in the Conservative caucus. The evidence is to the contrary, quite to the contrary. And what they're going to do about it and how they're going to respond and whether or not they're going to have a true reality check is something that we'll be watching very closely and, of course, talking about here on the podcast. Thanks, as always, for being with us. And by the way, if you're watching us on YouTube today, please hit that notification bell and pass the word on to others. And thank you to everybody who has been subscribing. We've had a great rush of support over the last little while, and we really do appreciate that because it really helps us to continue the work that we're doing to bring you these issues and these opinions so that we can have an informed discussion about what's happening in our country. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work doing the production on this one. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.